We're just going to get started in a few minutes here. We're just going to wait for everybody else to trickle in. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started now. So we're very excited to introduce all of our MPs and our speakers here today. We've got someone from all of the major political groups, which we're so grateful for and we're very excited about. So we have Diane Sachs, we have Nathaniel Erskine Smith, Matthew Green, Peggy Nash, and Rachel Harder. So we're going to start off with our first question just to sort of give everybody an idea of your background and where you came from. So please just introduce yourself and tell us where you went to school and what you studied. So let's start with Matthew for this one.
I am the very proud member of Parliament representing Hamilton Centre, the Hamilton Centre. Born and raised in Hamilton, traveled all the way to the East Coast to attend Acadia University for 4 very proud years before returning home to Hamilton to McMaster for a bit of a victory lap in a 5th year type scenario.
That's amazing. Okay, let's go with Peggy next.
I am from Toronto. I'm a former MP from Parkdale High Park. Grew up in Rexdale, went to the University of Toronto and McMaster University, and did my MA at York, and have traveled a lot, but always came back to Toronto.
That's amazing. Thank you, Peggy. Let's hear from Diane next.
Hi there. I'm born and grown up in central Toronto. I went to the University of Toronto, which is in University of Rosedale, where I am the Green Party candidate. I'm also the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario. And I got both of my law degrees from York University, undergrad a long time ago, and then a PhD after 15 years of practice.
And what did you get your PhD in?
In law. I actually have a PhD in law. I didn't have enough of it the first time. It's hard to tell why.
That's amazing. Nate, let's move on to you.
So I'm here in Beaches, East York, and East End of Toronto. I went to public school and high school here, and then went off to Queen's University for 7 years doing politics and law. And my wife and I had this plan to get married when we were done school. So we got married, and then we were suckers for punishment. So she went and did a master's in nutrition at Oxford Brookes, and I went and did a master's of law at Oxford. And so way too much school, actually, as far as it goes.
That's amazing. And Rachel, what about you?
Awesome. My name is Rachel, and I have the privilege of serving as the Member of Parliament for Lethbridge, Alberta. So I'm the Westerner on the call. And I was born and raised in Alberta on a small farm. I went to university at the University of Lethbridge, which is the community that I currently live in. I originally came there to do my degree in education and completed that, and then also studied sociology, political science, and psychology. Ended up taking on a job that took me across Canada, interviewing 18 to 34-year-olds and understanding the trends that exist within that generation, and then published and consulted across the country. And so my passion is young people and training for leadership.
That is amazing, Rachel. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our first big question. So thank you all so much for being here again. So we only have 45 minutes, so I'm just going to remind you to keep your answers to about 1 to 2 minutes maximum. So our first question would be, how old were you when you joined your party, and why did you join at that particular time? A sort of a sub question to that would be, in your time as a student, were you involved in your campus political party? So let's start with Diane for this one.
Well, I spent my entire adult life carefully avoiding political entanglement. I was not involved in politics as a student, as a practicing lawyer, obviously not when I worked for the government, and I really hoped to spend the rest of my life not being involved in politics. But that isn't what happened. So I joined the Green Party last year, a year after the Ford government in Ontario passed federal legislation to break my contract and abolish my office and eliminate the opportunity for me to contribute to public policy as the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. Also, it just seems to me that at this point, we're so close to the edge of the climate and environmental crisis that everyone who can must. And so instead of just retiring, which would have been a lot easier, I've thrown my hat into yet another career.
Thank you so much for that answer. So you weren't involved in your political group on campus then, since you weren't really hoping to get involved with politics?
When I was interviewed for the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, one of the things they asked me was my political background. And the interview group actually laughed out loud because I had at that point, over the course of 60 plus years, been a member of each party at least once, but I couldn't remember whether it was provincial or federal. I didn't remember when, and I had no real involvement with anybody. There had been friends running at different points that I had tried to help out a little bit, but honestly, I, like so many other people in the environmental world, felt that there was more to gain and more to do in public policy than in politics, that politics is somehow dirty and unpleasant, and besides, a terrible place for women and an even worse place for Jewish women and an even worse place for Jewish women who work on climate. And so I ran as far away from it as I could possibly go for almost my entire life.
That's amazing. Let's go on to Rachel to answer this question.
Sure. So I've always had an interest in my community and giving back. I think it was largely the way that I was raised. I didn't always understand that in my future that would mean politics, but I certainly had the passion to invest in the well-being of others and to serve the betterment of my community. I also had this innate belief that I had the responsibility and the ability to give back and to make a positive difference or impact on the world. And so from a really young age, I was always involved in humanitarian efforts, as well as volunteer efforts, as well as leadership efforts throughout my community. And so for me, entering political life was just simply an extension of that. It just wasn't exactly premeditated. So during my time in university, I started to be inspired by different political figures in my life at the time, and thought perhaps maybe I would enter into politics one day, and actually didn't really think that it would be me putting my name on a ballot, but maybe more working behind the scenes in an advisory role or something like that. Basically, what ended up happening is I had a number of people who encouraged me to consider running, and a number of really key mentors in my life. And I think through that process discerned that perhaps it was something that I could do. Admittedly, putting my name on a ballot was one of the most intimidating things that I have ever done. It is not within my nature to put myself out there and to allow others to scrutinize me, weigh and measure me, and then determine whether or not I would be worthy of their vote. And living in a fishbowl is not exactly a comfortable state of existence for me. However, out of a deep sense of call for serving my community, I did move forward and did that. So to be honest, putting my name on a ballot was actually very short. It was very quickly after I even joined the party and got involved. So I was about 24 years old when I got involved and was sitting on my board and my party's local board, and started engaging in that way. I was also involved in municipal politics, managing a local campaign. And then it was when I was 26 that I determined that I was going to run for the nomination and become the Conservative Party candidate. So that was kind of the path that I took. And then, of course, once I became the candidate, then I ran in the 2015 election, and then for the second time in the 2019. And it's been a lot of fun. It's had its ups and downs for sure, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about what that experience has entailed. But overall, it's been an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you, Rachel. That's super informative to everyone who might be a little bit hesitant, but it's so worth it. Let's move on to Nate for this one.
So my parents were teachers, and my dad was quite involved in the union and the NDP. So I actually grew up in a more NDP household, and my first political experiences would have been with the NDP in campaigns in high school and in undergrad. Didn't stick though, and so I was involved, I suppose, more seriously myself, getting involved in politics as a local city council candidate, where I lost miserably in Kingston when I was maybe 21 or something like that. And I learned everything not to do. And then I said I'd never do this again. And I went off and did more school. And it was actually a friend of mine who was the president of a liberal riding association in the Niagara area, who when I was overseas in the UK, I was helping him write various op-eds in his local paper, and I was getting more involved with him. And when I got back, we had conversations about getting involved in politics more seriously, and I joined my local riding association. And so I would have been in my, I guess, mid-20s when I started to maybe turn my mind more seriously to personally getting involved in partisan politics, other than just sort of as a background volunteer. And it would have been, I guess, late 20s that I then put my name forward as a candidate in the nomination.
Okay, thank you for that, Nate. Let's move on to Peggy for this one.
I grew up in an apolitical family, and at university I studied French literature and language, so it was not exactly a political on-ramp. But one summer I needed to improve my French, so I went and worked as a nanny in France, and I ended up working for two journalists who had just come back from Chile in Latin America under the Allende government. And it was a real education for me. So at university, I was already getting interested in international solidarity. So I spent my 20s doing that. And I really saw myself to the left of the NDP. That was not something I was interested in. And I got active in my union. And that was most of my career, was being a union activist. So I have a deep respect for movement politics, and I'm interested in the connection between movements and electoral politics. It wasn't till much later in my career I thought, there's a limit to what you can do if you're not actually at the table making decisions. So that prompted me to want to run I think it was really a period of cutbacks, the Harris government, the Croatian government, and I just got so frustrated. I thought, no, I can do a better job. So I decided to run. But I joined the party when I was, I don't know, in my 30s, I think, just because as a union member, a lot of people encouraged me to take out a membership. I didn't knock on doors, but I didn't see myself as a party person until much later in life, which sounds funny for someone who was the former president of the party. But that was my journey.
Thank you so much for that, Peggy. Let's move on to Matthew for this one.
First of all, what a fantastic opportunity it is to get to know a little bit more about my colleagues and the folks that are on this panel. It's great. We don't often get this chance. For myself, I'm a new Democrat. And to Peggy's acknowledgement, I too saw myself left of the party and perhaps not seeing my values or my people reflected in the party in substantive ways. I came to the party late, but I came to the party at a moment in time that I've been calling the new civil rights. And in my grassroots organizing work, in my activism, I was a pretty ardent defender for civil rights related to the practice of police checks and racial profiling. And there are very few people politically who would take that on. As a city councillor, I was one of them. And there was a young deputy leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party called Jagmeet Singh, who was also very early and earnest in taking on that very difficult conversation. So I knew when he was running for leadership that I had an opportunity to either engage in the process, join the party and organize people, and kind of do what I like to do best, or just watch and hope that the right person with the right politics would become leader of the party and take it in a direction in which I was willing to go. So I ended up leaving municipal government. I had been elected in 2014 as the first person of color in my city's 170 plus year history. And I left municipal politics, stepped down, and then decided to run as a New Democrat in 2017.
Wow, that's amazing. That is quite the story. That's wonderful. All of you had such amazing backgrounds coming to this point. Let's move on to our next question. So this is sort of a follow-up to the first question, and some of you already touched on this a bit, but as a student, were you involved in student societies and campaigns? Did you have any political jobs or internships? And how did these experiences help shape your career? So let's start with Rachel for this one.
Sure. So I think I'll start by answering it with my personal experience, I guess, and that is I didn't have any formal experience being involved in political clubs on campus when I was a student in university. Like I said, that came just after I finished my degree. I joined my local conservative board and got involved that way. And as previously stated, I also was involved in municipal politics and helped run a campaign. And so those were really good experiences for me. But I think also, you know, what was so important in shaping me as an individual, but also shaping my perspective as someone who's now an elected official, was my involvement in the community on a volunteer basis. So I volunteered to be a part of the Economic and Social Development Board for my city, which was a really great opportunity to learn about board governance and an opportunity to learn about the structure of my municipality, and to be able to give back. And I volunteered in organizing a number of different community events. I volunteered at various organizations working with children and working with seniors. And then of course had quite a bit of experience going overseas and doing humanitarian projects as well. And so I think that larger collection of experiences and those opportunities to give back to my community, both locally and globally, really shaped who I am and how I view the world around me. And I think, you know, has really actually empowered me to effectively represent my community.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let's move on to Peggy for this one.
No, I guess, you know, nobody in my family had ever been to university, so I had no clue that there were jobs like internships or even, you know, campus political party clubs. I didn't know that, but I also, I was the first person in my family to go to university, and you know, it took from Rexdale, it was an hour and a half bus and subway ride to get to class, or which I did for a couple of years, and then if I lived downtown off campus, I had to work part-time. So I really, it's sad because you miss a lot of opportunities. I wish I had the opportunity to kind of broaden my horizons in that way. But as I said, about a different culture in France, but I also got to learn something about Latin American politics, which then became a passion of mine for, well, really for all my life. So, but I think now that I teach students in politics, I strongly encourage them to take opportunities, not only for internships, but other kinds of community engagement and leadership opportunities, being able to participate in a campaign or go and shadow a city councillor or MP really is such an eye-opener. So that's what I try to do, is connect students to those opportunities.
Thank you so much for that, Peggy. You have so much insight on what comes after the MP. It's really incredible to hear, and especially for all the students. Let's hear from Diane on this one.
Well, as I already said, I wasn't involved in politics, but like Rachel and Peggy, I grew up with a very strong commitment to public service. And so I always did an enormous amount of volunteer work. In university, I was on the newspaper, so, you know, getting a sense of the importance of facts and communication and representing people's points of view and communicating things well. As a lawyer, I was very involved in the Law Society, in the Bar Association, where we had public policy initiatives, drumming up support and drafting proposals for legislation and responses to key legislative and legal issues. I also volunteered for many years with my synagogue and with a local seniors home where I read services for about 25 years and still would have, I guess I will again after COVID. I did a lot of mentoring of young people, and so constantly get asked for advice from young people who want to know how to get an environmental law job. So what I found is, plus of course there's lots of charities looking for pro bono work. There's a lot of opportunities to contribute to the public good, both within and outside politics. And so for most of my career, I looked for the ones that were outside politics, and now I'm trying the other kind.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Diane. Let's move on to Matthew.
Yeah, I guess the TDLR on my story is that at 4th grade, I saw this big, elegant, strapping man at an event in Hamilton who was probably one of the most powerful Black men that I'd ever seen in public, in real life, in the Honorable Lincoln Alexander at a local community event. And I remember asking my mom, like, who is he and what does he do? And she told me that he was the lieutenant governor and he was a politician. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so I, in middle school, I was like the treasurer for the student council. In high school, I was on the student council and on the athletic council. In university, I started an athletic union because I felt like the administration was pitting male sports against the women's sports in inequitable ways. And so we got together and kind of worked to help everybody at the university. And I ran for student body president at Acadia University, which is like this small Baptist liberal college out in Nova Scotia, with this radical new student movement. And I lost to Michael Peddle by 96 votes. He was the beer rep, and I just couldn't compete with the free beer he was able to give out. But there was very important lessons to learn. And Nate will appreciate this. I know he'll appreciate this. For a very brief time, I was part of the Young Liberals of Nova Scotia on campus, in which I experienced the carnage of a convention. And I tore up my membership and I swore off partisan politics and never looked back. So, in ways that we kind of find ourselves in different politics in different times, I think a lot of it is just social and who you surround yourself with. And, the parties that do the best in reaching out to young folks will be able to find them in ways that hopefully compel them to action at any particular point in time in their life or their careers.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Speaking of Nate, let's move on to you now.
Well, it's interesting hearing that, because I do remember attending an NDP event and feeling that same way. And I think it is just the difference, maybe as a younger person, where you are not used to this notion of party politics and team first, and we're all, there's a certain mob mentality that I was driven away from in a really serious way, and I didn't revisit partisan politics after that. But I would say student politics did loom large in my own life when I think back. I certainly was heavily involved in student council for 3 years in high school in a serious way, and that meant that led me to really strong volunteer and community involvement that I wouldn't otherwise have had. Obviously teaches you to engage, learn names, and just know many people in your school environment, which is really, you can't underestimate the importance in politics of knowing names and having some personal connection to people in your community. And if I can emphasize anything for anyone interested in politics, it is just that. I ran for city council in Kingston, I lost miserably because I really didn't have a community there. Whereas when I went to run in the nomination in Beaches East York, I went to public school and I was calling on people who I went to public school with. They didn't care about my politics. I went to high school people. They didn't care about my politics. I played baseball with people. They didn't care about my politics. And they were willing to sign up because I had a community here. I suppose the other experiences that I would highlight too, not only, I was kind of burnt out when I got to undergrad, so as it relates to involvement, so I kind of took a step back. I wasn't as involved in politics when I went to undergrad. But when I think back to the service experience I had in restaurants, when I think back to working at a call center, when I think back to being an umpire, like there are all sorts of experiences that are apolitical in some ways, but really teach you how to deal with people and connect with people in a really serious way, and therefore make you a better politician. So, and I suppose the only thing I would mention as well, just about student experiences as it relates to politics, is I got really involved. I went to law school in part because I got involved in a mooting competition, which is sort of a mock trial competition. I got into public speaking competitions, and that in some ways led me to law school. And then in law school, I really studied political philosophy, and that's why I went to Oxford. I did constitutional law and political philosophy there as well. And I got involved in politics partly because there was this huge disconnect. I, out of my studies, really believe that politics, legislative action, is a really noble endeavor. And then, you hear Diane rightly say, well, a lot of people think politics is kind of a dirty business. And there's a huge disconnect between what politics should be and how people perceive politics. And that was one thing that really drove me out of my studies to get involved.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. That's so insightful, and it's so interesting to hear about the apolitical things that you can do that still shape your entire career. So this next question is specifically for Peggy. Where did your career take you post-election, and how has your relationship with your party evolved since leaving the House of Commons?
Well, it took me here to Ryerson, so that's a really positive thing. But for anybody who has lost an election, people react in different ways. I ran 5 times, and I ran in a leadership race, so I had experience both winning and losing. Little in joke, winning is way better. And in 2015, after we had been official opposition with over 100 MPs, and Jack Layton had named me finance critic, and I just thought, wow, this is amazing. We might really have a chance to do something. And then after a 3-month campaign, not only you're out of a job, you're out of any possibility of making that difference. I found it really challenging. And yet everyone, all of us who are involved in politics know that losing is a part of it. And most people understand there's a good chance you're not going to win. But I just found that loss particularly difficult. So it took me a while to kind of find my footing. And so I do that by keeping busy. I had done election observation in the past. I began to do more of that. I began training politicians internationally. Went back and did a master's degree in politics. I did a lot of things to try to get perspective. And then a lot of people, as Diane had mentioned, a lot of people came to me, had come in the past and were continuing to come and talk to me about politics. How do I run? How do I get involved? And I've always said, anybody in any party, I will share my experience and encourage them, because I believe that whatever party you're in, being engaged in politics is a wonderful thing. It's an exercise in our democracy. Some people say partisan politics is a bad thing. I think it's a very important democratic piece of our democracy, because parties, as crazy as conventions are, they are a democratic structure that people can participate in. And I was surprised after 2015 that the NDP did not connect as well with defeated MPs as they could have. I think the Liberals do a much better job at that, at reaching out to people. And so while I'm still a New Democrat, I support the party, I do media commentary, write about politics, but I have a little more independence now, and quite frankly, a little more time for the first time in my life to spend with friends and family. But I do try to keep busy. I teach, I write, I try to engage as much as possible. And it's a kind of freedom that I haven't had ever in my career. It's interesting.
Wow, thank you so much. That's so informative and amazing. And yeah, it's so amazing to see all the things that you can do after leaving the House of Commons. And it's so nice that you have some extra time now. That must be great. So let's move on to our next question. This is for everybody again. Given the shifting linguistic landscape of Canada, how important is English-French bilingualism for a career in politics? Do you speak any other languages, and how has that helped your career? So let's start with Nate for this one.
I'm lucky if I speak English eloquently on a good day. So my French, I try, and I have been taking lessons, but my French is poor, I would say. My goal before my political career is over would be to give a short speech in the House of Commons in French, but it requires a confidence I don't yet have. In terms of other languages, I don't have any. I think it is important, bilingualism in federal politics. I would be a better MP if I spoke fluent French. There's no question about that. Just in terms of, at a minimum, so much of politics is building coalitions, not only across parties but within parties. And I do my best to engage Quebec colleagues whose English is rusty or undeveloped, but I would be much better at engaging those colleagues if I was fluent in French and I could converse in their mother tongue. So I do think that bilingualism, not only as it relates to the civil service, which is incredibly important engagement there too, but even just among colleagues, it's really important, I think. So we shouldn't, despite obviously a very multicultural country and other languages are increasingly of importance, I think bilingualism at the federal level will continue to be incredibly important.
Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to Matthew. What do you think about this?
Like, I'm doing French 3 times a week. It was astounding to come to Ottawa and just see the bilingualism from everybody, like folks from the prairies and Alberta and everybody speaking French, even though they don't have French constituencies, which of course speaks to the ambition of the House of Commons and people positioning themselves for potential future roles in ministries and so on and so forth, leadership. But I think to know a language is to better know a people, and to serve in this way, not just French, but to begin to understand and be comfortable around Indigenous languages, to the constituencies that you serve that may have significant populations. The better you can get to understand and appreciate their language, I think the better you can understand their culture. And so I think it's incredibly important. And my goal is to get the kind of fluency in French where I can fluently heckle in French, because I feel like I'm missing at least 50% of my game in that regard.
Just don't heckle when I'm giving that one speech in French.
I'll say bravo, bon travail, and they say bon travail. I often like to encourage my Bloc Québécois neighbors in French, both in good times and bad.
Thank you so much for that. Let's hear from Rachel on this.
Yeah, so I would echo my colleagues who have spoken so far. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to take French in high school, and so I was raised in a small rural area. So as a result, coming to Ottawa, I found this new opportunity and of course wanted to take advantage of it. Like Mr. Green and Mr. Erskine-Smith, I have found it a little bit difficult to jump in and to learn the language, but certainly it's an incredible blessing and opportunity to have it at my fingertips here in the House of Commons on Parliament Hill. And so I've jumped in and like them, would have the ambition or the desire to learn as quickly as possible and to be able to deliver a speech in the House. I don't know that I share Mr. Green's desire to be able to heckle in French, though that could be fun as well. And but I do think it's so important, I do, because we are a bilingual country. It is a part of our culture. It's a part of our heritage. It's a part of who we are as Canadians. And so I do believe that every single individual should have the opportunity to learn both languages and should be encouraged to do so. So as an elected official, I certainly need to lead in that. And it's, I think it's so important for me. In addition to that, I have colleagues in the House of Commons who with whom it's difficult for me to be able to communicate without a translator. And I would really like to be able to have those conversations, whether that's with, colleagues who are, within my own party who only speak French or primarily French, or with individuals who, are members of other parties. I would very much enjoy being able to have those conversations. So that's really important to me. So I'll continue to learn.
Thank you so much. Peggy, what do you think on this?
I'm a bit of a language nerd. As I said, I studied French language and literature in university, and I didn't get a lot of it in high school, but I was just highly motivated. I don't know. I love languages. So I'm bilingual, and it's just bravo to my colleagues for, making the effort to learn. I think it's one of the incredible privileges that MPs have, is the opportunity to learn French. And I certainly, as often as I could, take advantage of French training opportunities in Ottawa, just because I live in an Anglophone community, to keep improving my French. And, it's not that you walk down the streets of Toronto and you have a lot of chances to speak to people in French, but every so often I'd find a constituent who's Francophone. But I love the opportunity in Ottawa, in the House, to be able to participate in both languages. You just really get a sense of the vastness of the country to be able to engage in bilingualism. So it's a wonderful opportunity but it's not prerequisite. You don't have to have French before you run for office. And there are MPs who spend their career in Ottawa and never learn to speak French. I just think it's unfortunate they don't take the opportunity. I also speak Spanish because I spent a lot of time in Latin America and I studied it at university. And when I was elected, there's a large Ukrainian community in our area. And I did a lot of election observation in Ukraine. So I learned to say, Menizvati Peginash, Yaya Deputat Parlament Tuvi Parktel High Park, Yaya Shazleva Butetu. So I tried to learn a bit of Ukrainian. So that's my nerdy hobby, is learning languages.
That's so amazing. That's such a great way to connect with people. Diane, let's hear from you.
Well, I'm in the provincial party, provincial Green Party, and French is not nearly as prominent in the Ontario legislature as it is in the federal parliament. I delivered 17 reports as the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. Most of them all but the very small special reports we delivered in both official languages, and I took media questions in both official languages. I also was the main proofreader in French for these reports, most of which were about 200 to 300 words, 200 to 300 pages long and longer in French. So I definitely found my French helpful, and I appreciated the opportunity to practice it. But in my writing, it's not very relevant. We have a very significant Chinese community. We have thousands of people whose first languages are Arab or Farsi or Portuguese or Italian. We have a small community whose first language is French. And then of course we have an Indigenous community as well. So one of the things I did as commissioner was make sure that we had at least our central documents available in 15 languages, including 3 Indigenous languages. That was a lot of work, and it was certainly well beyond my personal ability to communicate in all of those languages. But recognizing that for a lot of people, having access to information important and relevant to them in a language that they're comfortable in is really valuable. And so that's something we're working on right now for the campaign website as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Proofreading French documents, that's bilingualism.
Well, it's interesting because I am better in English. And so proofreading in French is much harder. It forces me to go slower and therefore makes me more accurate, and also means I learn the material more thoroughly if I have to, not to mention those bloody acronyms in French. It was a really useful learning tool to make sure that I was the complete master of all the material in my reports.
That's amazing.
All of a sudden, I'm feeling like my bar is set pretty low.
I think mine is too. That's amazing.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next question. Gen Z will be the first generation that has their entire lives documented online. How do you see this changing the landscape of electoral politics in the coming years, specifically in terms of party recruitment, electability, and voter engagement? Let's start with Matthew for this one.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in this kind of post-Trump era. I mean, I say that I think scandals are a relative term now. And I think the scrutiny that candidates used to get, this veneer of a perfect existence, is afforded only to generations that didn't have social media, and quite frankly is like the height of hypocrisy, generational hypocrisy, that they will chastise young people for doing things that are documented online that they themselves did in their youth. And so I'm calling for a free, open, and fair process for everybody to make mistakes in their youth and hopefully learn from them. But we got a situation where, oftentimes there's elected officials who quite openly talk about having broken the law, whether it was smoking a joint or something back in the day, in which they can do after they have achieved their power, but would, in some instances, cancel out the ability for a younger person to run. So I'm hoping that in a new culture of this panoptic prison we call social media, that we just realize that everybody has a little bit of mud on their shoes, and as long as it's not completely out of line with the values of your party, that there's a little bit more forgiveness for young people. And it's also true that I think this next particular generation, because millennials kind of tested the water and really messed things up, the Gen Z is also much more sophisticated because most of the ways in which they communicate automatically delete or erase anyways, right? So it's a much more sophisticated generation than mine, for sure.
Thank you. Let's move on to Nate for this one.
I'm not sure I've got a great answer in some ways. Obviously, campaigns shift a little bit insofar as people increasingly live their lives online and campaigns move to where people live. And so there will be more of a focus on digital campaigns, though I think in some ways that gets overdone as well. And there is back to basics in some ways, but I personally think the way you build support is to have meaningful connections with individuals and for people to see you as someone who is honest and hardworking and cares about the issues that they care about. And so how do you highlight that? How do you show that? I mean, yes, you have to be on the platforms that people live on, although I'm still wary of being on TikTok and embarrassing myself. So there are challenges to that too. But I do think it, knocking on doors is not really going to go out of style once it's safe to do so. Phone calls are still important. Meaningful, when I send out emails, I don't, I don't ask for money a whole lot of time. I try to make it as substantive as possible to the email list so people don't want to unsubscribe. So I think we just have to engage, I think, in as meaningful a way as possible, regardless of the platform, and hope that people take note. I don't know that it changes. I don't know that it changes everything about campaigns.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you for that. Let's see what Diane thinks about this one.
Well, I'm the beginner, right, in politics. And so not having done it before, I'm not really sure how different it is now, although everybody keeps telling me it's all different because of COVID. I certainly have sympathy to the point that my generation, the baby boomers, did lots of things wrong that were not permanently recorded in the same way that that things are recorded now, and certainly don't, or at least not as easy to research. It was funny for me when I went through the process of considering, and I did consider applying to the Liberal Party. They wanted a copy of everything I had ever published. Well, over 45 years of legal practice, I don't have everything I've ever published. And had I ever criticized the Liberal Party? Absolutely. I've criticized every government pretty much consistently my whole career. So the expectation that everything I'd ever said would be instantly, conveniently available for review seemed to me to be completely ridiculous. Although I suppose if for people now, I don't know how much they would publish that wouldn't be accessible. And yeah, I don't know how relevant it is if people made a mistake or learned something from experience. I think we've all learned from experience. Lord, if we haven't learned anything, we're probably not going to be very good representatives. So yes, I agree that we all make mistakes and we have to have some tolerance for the fact that people make mistakes and be able to look less at gotchas and more at, is this a good and trustworthy person working for the public interest? Now that's probably hopelessly naive, but there you go.
Thank you so much for that. Peggy, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I agree with Nathaniel that person-to-person contact is the most important. Someone once described social media to me as a hammer is to a carpenter. It's a useful tool for the carpenter, but it doesn't replace the carpenter. And you need those interpersonal relationships. And I think the more you develop those, the greater trust and tolerance there is. But Diane's point, I think, is also valid around maybe we need to be a little more forgiving. I do wonder, because I think this question gets to the process of vetting. And for those in attendance, you probably know this, but a party, before they will accept you as a candidate to run for the nomination for their party, you have to be vetted. The party has to say, okay, you can run under our banner and seek the nomination. usually in a contest. And people get bounced out of that process if they've had, shall we say, an active and, in some cases, troubling social media presence. I guess I do wonder, for a generation that will have spent its whole life documented on social media, whether there will be, as Matt says, perhaps greater forgiveness in the future, that we all screw up. And I guess, what are the boundaries of that? We saw the Prime Minister who people were willing to I don't know, forgive is the right word, but he got past it. And so I wonder what the limits are. If someone was sexist or abusive, or I don't know, supported a Nazi post 20 years ago. I think there are limits, but I do hope that, not that there's tolerance of that, but that there will be a greater tolerance of people just screwing up when they're young, as we all did. And thank God there were no cameras.
Thank you, Peggy. Rachel, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure, I think some excellent points have been raised so far. I suppose the only thing that I would maybe offer in addition is, I think as much as social media is increasing in use, and our presence is certainly largely online, especially in the midst of COVID, I am begging the question, what is life going to look like post COVID-19, and what are the human cravings going to be? And I think one of them is for community, for relationship, for human to human contact. And so I actually wonder if we're going to see Generation Z take a bit of a turn and actually seek out those face-to-face interactions to a greater extent. And I think it would serve us well if that was the shift that took place. I'm watching mental health concerns go through the roof. I'm watching people who are struggling with isolation and loneliness, depravity. I'm listening to young people who are longing to be known, to have a place of belonging, to be safe in their interactions with others, and to feel that sense of purpose. And all of that is birthed out of the context of having deep and meaningful relationships with people. And I think those relationships to some extent can be built online, but I think it's so much better when it's face to face. So those are some of my ponderings. But in terms of the application to the question that you've asked, I think it ultimately comes down to relationship. I think as those of us who are looking to run for political office, those of us who are, seeking to represent our constituents, it's about relationship. That it's about leaning in to listen, and then it's, taking action on behalf of those who have asked us to represent them. And so I very much think that means we have to engage with those individuals who are, within our constituencies and across Canada, of course, in our context. But the question has been asked to us, but the truth is, Gabby, I would love to hear others who are on the call. Actually, I think this would be such a fascinating conversation to have with young people and to hear their perspective, because the truth is I'm offering some of my reflections or some of my questions, but ultimately at the end of the day, I think it's Gen Zers that have the answer. They're the ones who can tell us where they're going and what they need and how we can best serve that generation going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rachel. And it's definitely changing every day, and it will definitely be interesting to see what ends up happening. We have flown through our time here today. Somehow we have had such a lovely conversation, but we are out of time, unfortunately. So I just wanted to thank all of our panelists so much. This has been so informative. We so appreciate you taking time out of your day. It's really insightful to see, all the different ways you can get to somewhere like the House of Commons, or, you know, like be a political member of society. And it's really fascinating, Peggy, to see like the paths you can go after the House of Commons, to see how all of you got to where you are today. So I just wanted to thank you again. For the participants right now, we will have a 15-minute break, and then we're going to reconvene at 11:15 for your workshops. So if you're interested in joining